Hello there friends, welcome back to another episode of Generation Tech. My name is Alan, and recently one of our Patreon supporters, James, reached out to me with a pretty interesting theory. He believes that one single fighter from the Clone Wars essentially changed the entire outcome of the Galactic Civil War and helped the rebellion win. Now, James is admittedly a massive fan of the Republic ship in question, the Incom Arc 170. He made it very clear that he has his own biases here, but his theory is actually pretty sound, and I think it's something worth discussing. So we know that the early Rebel Alliance was able to not only survive but flourish mainly thanks to the capabilities of its Starfighter Corps. While the Rebel Navy's capital ships and assortment of corvettes and frigates were always on the run from their Imperial counterparts, the Rebel Alliance's Starfighter Corps were far more flexible and able to do a lot more damage thanks to their robust capabilities, especially when you compare platforms like the T-65B X-Wing and RZ-1A Wing to the TIE Fighter. With Class 1 hyperdrives, heavy munitions, and shields, these well-rounded starfighters were able to carry out quick raids on poorly guarded installations, the Empire's soft logistical underbelly, and rarely did the rebels get caught thanks to the capabilities of their ships. The TIE Fighter, on the other hand, was mainly designed for short-range interception and local systems defense, armed with mainly just lasers and equipped with no shields or hyperdrives. This ship's limitations led to general poor performance by the Imperial Navy. And this was largely due to the fact that the Rebel Alliance were able to choose when and where they fought the Empire. And again, this is because their snub fighters are able to fly at FTL speeds. They can come and go whenever they liked. Now, it's not to say that the standard TIE Fighter was complete trash. It clearly was not. In a one-on-one dogfight, the TIE Fighter, usually piloted by an expertly trained Imperial pilot, had the upper hand against their Rebel counterparts. But Rebel groups were rarely focused on destroying Imperial war material. They were far more objective and mission-focused. And whenever their units were overwhelmed by large numbers of TIE Fighters, they usually just retreated into hyperspace. This was mainly because the rebellion had constant manpower shortages and valued the lives of their pilots above all else. So how do we get to this place where the Empire's main starfighter is so limited that it's an actual liability for the entire Navy? Well, you could attribute it to the cost-cutting measures the Empire adopted when it started building its new order. Their goal, after all, was to pacify the entire galaxy, and so they needed extremely cheap, mass-produced starfighters to do that. And that's where the TIE Fighter comes in, but I think there's a lot more to this. This is where James' theory comes into play. You see, our story starts all the way back in the Clone Wars period, when the Grand Army of the Republic appeared out of nowhere at Geonosis to take the battle to the Separatist droid army, which also appeared out of nowhere. The Republic Navy was also non-existent at the time. You had the initial dozen Acclimator-class assault ships used by the Kaminoans to deliver the first 250,000 clones, and then you had a few Jedi starfighters like the Delta 7 Aether Sprite and a few wings of prototype V-19 starfighters. After more than 1,000 years of peace, all the major shipbuilders in the galaxy were focused more on civilian and commercial designs. And even the starfighter manufacturers that existed were still mainly focused on fighters for security missions rather than full-on war. And so the starship manufacturing industry in the galaxy was, pretty non-competitive at the time, which meant you did have larger players like Quant Systems Engineering, but there was also a lot of room for new entries into the market. And that's kind of what you saw once the Republic started giving out contracts for new starfighters. If you take a look at the wide range of platforms developed for the Republic Navy during the Clone Wars, it's almost like the entire conflict was just a testing ground for various weapons, platforms, and starfighter doctrines. And that's because not only did the manufacturers not really know what they were doing, the Republic's top brass were also experimenting. There hadn't been, again, a conventional war in almost 1,000 years, and they were basically relearning a lot of things from scratch. As far as new manufacturers entering the starship manufacturing industry, you had players like Slane and Corporal, who were responsible for the V-19 prototype. You also had Conan Stair Manufacturing, a starship components company, who switched over to starship manufacturing once the contracts became available. Their first starfighter, the BTLB Y-Wing, was a reaction to the Republic's need for fighter bombers. You also had Incom Corporation, who prior to the Clone Wars was mainly known as a repulsor lift manufacturing company. They're actually the ones who built the repulsor lifts for Cloud City. It's pretty impressive. Their only pre-war starfighter at the time was the Z-95 Headhunter. It was a favorite amongst planetary defense forces and was quickly modernized and upgraded for the Republic Navy. And this would open up the door for future starfighter contracts. The Z-95, as we mentioned, was not designed for battlefields, but more for patrolling and anti-piracy missions. And so, like a lot of starfighters for this industry, the Z-95 lacked a hyperdrive. And that's because for planetary defense, you don't really need to travel to other places, right? Like, you're just supposed to be in the local system defending. What the Republic wanted was a robust starfighter that could do it all: interception, assault, bombing, and long-range reconnaissance. In those early days, the Republic Navy was completely outnumbered by their separatist counterparts, and so finding the enemy fleet was just as important as fighting them. The Confederacy was able to field such a massive navy in such a short time because they basically turned their fleet of commercial vessels into naval vessels by upgrading them for combat. The Republic desperately needed creative solutions to help them catch up in the quantity of starships. And this is where Incom brings in the ARC-170 starfighter design. Officially developed before the Clone Wars even started, the ARC-170 was basically a response to piracy. Anti-piracy missions were amongst the leading reason why people needed starfighters anywhere in the galaxy. As we mentioned before, the Z-95 was literally Incom's first attempt to build a starfighter. Actually, they jointly built it with the help of shipbuilders Subpro Corporations, a veteran in the industry. So the idea behind the ARC-170 was kind of crazy. It was just, let's take the Z-95 and bolt on as much crap onto it as possible. Make the ultimate ship with all the functions you would want. And the result, in my opinion, is really just a starship with an ugly duckling syndrome. No offense, James, I know you love this thing, but let me explain. Had the Republic Navy had more experience in prior wars and had a more focused starfighter and naval doctrine, I think something like the ARC-170 would have never been created, at least for a multi-purpose starfighter contract. But again, things were like a fever dream in the early years of the Clone Wars. No one really knew what was going on. It was chaotic, confusing. The Seppies were turning bulk freighters into battleships, and giant fleets were emerging out of thin air. The Republic was designing awkward-looking walker tanks that served as infantry fighting vehicles so they can fight in all different types of terrains. Everyone was trying to think outside the box, and Incom wasn't all that different. Sure, they had a more traditional, repulsor lift department that generated a lot of the revenue for the company, but you also had the starship manufacturing side, which is functioning almost like a startup company. They were very innovative, very quick to adopt new technologies, take big risks, exactly the opposite of more traditional manufacturers. Instead of going for a more conservative design, the ARC-170 featured a much larger frame than any starfighter of the war at 12.7 meters in length, with a crazy 20-meter wingspan. This thing dwarfed the much smaller Vulture droid used by the Separatist Alliance, which was only about 7 meters in length. Even next to the V-Wing, which was very much a multi-purpose starfighter used by the Republic late in the war, the ARC-170 was still massive. This ship also had 3 crew members, a pilot, a co-pilot, and a rear gunner, along with an astromech. The idea behind this was for a long-range reconnaissance mission, you could rotate pilots so you could continue to operate the ship without resting. But because the second pilot made the starfighter even larger and less maneuverable, you had to add in a third crew member with a rear-facing laser for better defense, which of course makes the ship even larger. And to make matters even worse, Incom Corporation decided to get fancy when it came to armament. Instead of having faster-firing light laser cannons on board this thing like every other starfighter, the ARC-170 had 2 medium laser cannons on its wingtips. These are weapons usually reserved for like gunships or corvettes. Not only were medium cannons too big for a starfighter like the ARC-170, these were the only forward-facing energy weapons they had. So unless you were firing a proton torpedo after a Vulture droid you're chasing, this was it. You also had a fairly expensive and complicated sensor and communication package on board, as the ARC-170's secondary role is reconnaissance. Now, if you think about it, in the early days of the Clone Wars, the ARC-170 makes a lot of sense. This was before the Republic even had the Venator-class Star Destroyers, and was basically using diplomatic cruisers and judicial ships hastily upgraded with weapons to do most of its fighting. The ARC-170 could go to different systems by itself, search out separatist fleets and battle groups, and then even engage some of those ships by itself. It's perfect during that stage of the war. It actually sounds a lot like what the Rebel Alliance needed during their conflict against the Empire. And in some ways, that was kind of like the situation the Republic was in the early days of the war, completely outgunned and outnumbered. But by the time the ARC-170 is actually deployed, the war had progressed onto its next stage. The Republic had emerged with a larger carrier fleet thanks to the Venator-class Star Destroyer, with many different specialized units filling all sorts of roles. The ARC-170 would struggle to find itself amongst this very crowded field of fighters. For instance, during the Battle of Malstar, one of the earlier missions this platform took part in, the ARC-170 was used to escort BTLB Y-Wings. And then at the Battle of Lola Seyu, they were used to break through an enemy blockade and dogfight droid fighters. These same ships were also used for aid delivery missions on the planet of Aline after a natural disaster, and then later again used during the Battle of Umbara as breakthrough vessels, targeting the Separatist blockade over the planet. Eventually it became pretty clear to the clone officers operating these ARC-170s that this ship was primarily designed as kind of a breakthrough weapon. It's good for slashing attacks and assaults on blockades, where the ARC-170 could leverage its heavy payload and firepower along with its decent straight-line speed and robust armor. It could deliver a pretty powerful package onto an enemy capital ship and then avoid most of its return fire and get safely back home. Again, ideal for the Rebellion in many ways, but for the Republic, well, they already had the Y-Wing doing exactly the same thing. Plus, once you get into a turning fight with a droid fighter with the ARC-170, especially the Tri-Droid fighter, this Incom Starfighter really struggled. It handled kind of like a boat. The ARC-170 was like the Chrysler 300 of its galaxy. Blockade busting is a very niche skill to have for a fighter platform, and so is long-range reconnaissance missions. And let me tell you, the initial contract for the ARC-170 was a lot larger than a niche deployment, and so you had a lot of these fighters just lying around doing nothing, having difficulties finding missions. Things only got worse as the war evolved from one full of movement, feints, and planet-hopping campaigns to one where the Separatists were just bogged down and besieged in their own heartland. Suddenly, reconnaissance and blockade running was not necessary anymore. And then during the Battle of Coruscant, literally the worst thing that could possibly happen to the ARC-170 happened. A large number of ARC-170s have been pulled from the front lines and brought to the rear on Coruscant, where these large and impressive warbirds look great in front of the cameras, probably boosted morale knowing you have these things stationed on your home planet. But to make matters worse, they weren't being piloted by clone pilots. Actually, this was a program to train clone infantry to become pilots because there was such a shortage of clone pilots at the time. They were basically cross-training units like the 501st. And so when the Separatists launched their surprise attack on Coruscant, one of the first group of fighters to meet the enemy were squadrons of infantry soldiers in ARC-170 starfighters. Guys who clearly only had simulation time and not real experience in a dogfight. Remember, no one expected Coruscant to be threatened at the time. This was supposed to be the rear of the rear. Most of the Separatist Navy was cornered in the outer rim by the Republic offensive, and so Coruscant's defenders and defense systems were poorly prepared and poorly motivated. In the initial Separatist invasion, a good percentage of the Coruscant home fleet is just destroyed in orbit. It's only thanks to the arrival of the Circle fleet in relief that the home fleet managed to survive at all. And so during the aerial battle of Coruscant, the ARC-170 fought bravely, but it was in a role that it was just not, built for. It wasn't attacking enemy blockades or fleets. It was in a defensive role, protecting and screening Republic capital ships from enemy fighters. The ARC-170 quickly found itself completely outnumbered and outmaneuvered by droid tri-fighters, vulture droids, and of course those pesky and dangerous buzz droids. Because the battlefield was so crowded and full of debris, the ARC-170 couldn't really use its straight-line speed to escape the enemy and was forced again into knife fights. Once the Battle of Coruscant was over, it was clear the ARC-170 performed the worst out of every fighter that was deployed by the Republic Navy. To make matters worse, this battle didn't take place in the Outer Rim. It took place right in front of the Republic military brass, the political elite, all of the main starship manufacturers in the galaxy, all the various think tanks and policymakers, and suddenly the ARC-170 was just bombarded with terrible press and opinions, and it just completely botched its most important performance in a test that was completely rigged against it. After the Battle of Coruscant, there was a notable shift in Republic Starfighter doctrine. First, we see an effort to consolidate the various platforms used by the Republic Navy during the war. In peacetime, the hope is you only need one or two different platforms to suit all of your needs. It was quickly apparent that the Republic brass wanted to move away from larger ships like the ARC-170 and went in the complete opposite direction. Ultimately, the Alpha 3 Nimbus class V-Wing would win out with its twin ion design. This was a ship that was just a meter longer than the Vulture droid and quite compact. It wasn't deployed with a hyperdrive and had no heavy munitions. It was highly maneuverable, and clearly the Republic's reaction to the droid fighter. See, the Battle of Coruscant not only rocked the galactic elite, it also rocked the military elite. Everyone was terrified of deploying another platform like the ARC-170, a larger vessel that was more costly to manufacture and also had 3 crew members. There was a noticeable shift in the culture of the Republic Navy that went towards favoring more agile, nimble, and minimalistic single-seat fighters. This is why the Empire ultimately chose the TIE Fighter line for its next-generation Starfighter program. Like many military forces throughout history, the Empire had built their new military to fight the last war, a conflict against an enemy utilizing extremely maneuverable droid fighters. Now obviously the Rebellion came second, and they had plenty of time to study the Empire and adapt their fleet to perfectly balance out the Empires, or perfectly fight the Empires. But the Empire was never able to pivot quickly in response because the TIE Fighter was already such an extreme concept. One that was born out of a naval culture that feared well-rounded starship designs, again because of the failures of the ARC-170. It's kind of like how the French army, after surviving World War I, built the Maginot Line thinking that the next conflict with Germany will also involve heavy amounts of trench warfare, when in fact the Germans had gone in the complete opposite direction and mechanized the infantry and used maneuver warfare in World War II. Heck, they ended up going around the Maginot Line completely through this wooded area that people tell me is not just an assault corridor for fascists to run through, but a country called Belgium. And I guess the important lesson here is if your military suffers, a big defeat, you don't immediately just go in the opposite direction and build your military to avoid that same situation. First assess the situation a little closer. In the ARC-170's case, this starship lost because it was performing a role that it wasn't designed for. It's all about balance at the end of the day. If you have a balanced platform, its weaknesses are going to also be limited. When you have a more extreme design like the TIE Fighter, then your weaknesses are also going to be much more extreme and easier to exploit, at which point you're going to find yourself in a world of hurt. And so, as James states in his original thesis he sent me, I do think he is correct in assessing that the ARC-170's failure at Coruscant played a huge part in the development of the TIE Fighter as the main starfighter for the Empire. Remember that Incom originally built the T-65B X-Wing for the Empire, and it was already in production before it was halted because of some potential design issues. But I would argue the real reason was the military establishment at the time was just against the idea of, a robust, well-designed, multi-purpose starfighter. They wanted something cheap and something that if they lose, they're not going to lose too much resources as a result. And it wasn't just about, wanting cheap and mass-produced fighters. Like the TIE Fighter was definitely very efficient in that way. It had a revolutionary twin-ion engine design with no moving parts and even less maintenance. But take a look at the Empire's capital ships. Look at their walkers. They're giants. Look at the Death Star. It's massive. When the Empire builds things, they generally go with overkill. And actually, the TIE Fighter is the exception to the rule. And so, yeah, I think the disastrous performance of the ARC-170 at Coruscant was a huge factor in creating a culture where the TIE Fighter would exist. The Empire would have probably rolled out the T-65B X-Wing along with the TIE Fighter otherwise, and potentially used it in more remote areas of the galaxy, like the Outer Rim. Imagine if the Rebels in their A-Wings and Y-Wings had to fight X-Wings. That would be a pretty challenging situation for them. So there you have it, guys. That is my assessment of this theory. James, thank you so much for sending this to me. And for the rest of you guys out there, whether you're a Patreon supporter or not, you can also comment in just the YouTube videos. It is easier for me to see my Patreon messages because they go straight to my email. But if you guys have a good question, a good theory, a good idea, send them to me. I'm not going to make scripts for all of them, obviously. Most of them I do reject. But if you have a good idea, yeah, I'll turn it into a video and see where we can go with it. Anyway, guys, I hope you enjoyed today's video. Don't forget to subscribe, hit that notification button down below so you don't miss out on the rest of our awesome content. And as usual, my name is Alan, reminding you that my allegiance is to the Republic, the democracy. I'll see you next time.